Let's be clear from the start, this is not about blind faith, instant blessings, or emotional comfort. This is about accountability, recalibration, and long-term alignment. We were wrong about one major thing. We thought being chosen meant life would be easier, clearer, or faster. It doesn't. Being chosen means you are trusted with pressure, delay, and responsibility, because your impact requires it. Here are 5 principles you must understand if you're going to move forward without bitterness, distraction, or self-sabotage. Most people misunderstand delay because they measure progress emotionally instead of structurally. They expect movement to feel obvious, rewarding, and externally visible. When it doesn't, they assume something is wrong, either with the path, the timing, or themselves. But delay is not a random malfunction in life system. It is often a response to internal unreadiness, not external unfairness. If outcomes arrive the moment desire appeared, most people would collapse under what they asked for. Capacity is rarely built at the same speed as ambition, and delay exists to close that gap. Think about how people behave when they receive responsibility before discipline. Money without structure doesn't create freedom, it amplifies bad habits. Authority without emotional control doesn't create leadership, it creates instability. Visibility without identity doesn't create impact, it creates confusion. Delay functions like a buffer. It slows the arrival of outcomes until the internal system's judgment, restraint, consistency, patience can support the weight of success. What feels like waiting is often training in disguise. Emotionally, delay is uncomfortable because it removes immediate feedback. Humans are wired to associate effort with reward. When that loop breaks, doubt enters. The mind starts negotiating shortcuts. People begin to ask whether the work is worth it, whether another path would be easier, whether persistence is naive. This is where many quit, not because the path is wrong, but because the reward schedule is longer than their emotional tolerance. They mistake silence for rejection, when it is often a test of endurance. You can see this in everyday situations. Someone commits to improving their health. The first weeks are discipline heavy and result light. The scale barely moves, energy fluctuates, habits feel forced. Many stop there, concluding it doesn't work. But what's really happening is that the body is adjusting internally before external change becomes visible. The same applies to skill building, financial stability, and personal growth. Early effort rearranges foundations, not outcomes. If you quit during foundation building, you never experience compounding. Delay also filters intention. When results come slowly, only those with a clear reason continue. People who were driven by ego, validation, or comparison fall off early. What remains are those who can tolerate boredom, repetition, and uncelebrated consistency. That filtering process is not accidental. It's how long-term success stays rare. If rewards were immediate, everyone would persist. Delay preserves quality by discouraging those who aren't built for sustained focus. Another overlooked aspect of delay is decision refinement. When outcomes don't arrive instantly, you are forced to think. You observe patterns, track behavior, notice inefficiencies. You learn where effort leaks. You become more precise. Fast success often skips this stage. Slow progress forces it. Over time, this produces individuals who understand cause and effect at a deeper level. They know which actions move the needle and which are just noise. That clarity becomes an advantage later when speed actually matters. Delay also exposes attachment to timelines that were never grounded in reality. Many people adopt expectations based on stories, not statistics. They see highlights, not processes. They assume that if someone else reached a milestone in 2 years, they should too, ignoring differences in starting point, support, resources, and focus. Delay corrects these borrowed timelines. It forces you to operate based on your actual circumstances instead of imagined standards. This is uncomfortable, but it's honest. From a trade-off perspective, delay demands something specific: the willingness to invest effort without immediate confirmation. That is a rare skill. Most people require reassurance to continue. They need signs, praise, progress markers. Delay removes those comforts. The trade-off is clear. You exchange short-term certainty for long-term leverage. You give up the emotional relief of quick wins in return for outcomes that don't evaporate under pressure. There is also a behavioral consequence to delay that most people miss. When nothing seems to be happening, distractions become more tempting. Divided priorities creep in. People hedge their bets, splitting energy between multiple paths, hoping one will pay off faster. This usually backfires. Focus diluted by impatience rarely compounds. Delay requires concentration, not diversification of effort. The irony is that delay feels like wasted time, but distraction actually wastes it. Consider the difference between someone who stays committed during a slow season and someone who constantly pivots. The first builds depth, deeper skills, stronger judgment, more resilience. The second builds surface level familiarity with many things and mastery of none. Over years, the gap becomes irreversible. Delay rewards those who choose depth over novelty, even when depth is lonely and unglamorous. There is a psychological maturation that happens only during prolonged effort without payoff. You stop romanticizing outcomes. You stop chasing feelings. You start respecting systems. You learn to separate mood from responsibility. This shift is subtle but critical. People who experience it become less reactive, more strategic. They don't panic during downturns because they've already survived long periods of uncertainty. Delay hardens emotional decision-making without making it cold. Opportunity cost is another reason delay exists. Every path chosen eliminates others. If success arrived too quickly, people will commit without understanding what they're giving up. Delay forces repeated recommitment. Each day you continue, you are consciously choosing this path over alternatives. That repetition strengthens alignment. By the time results arrive, you're no longer guessing whether this is what you want. You've already paid for the answer in time and discipline. Many people interpret delay as a sign to quit when it's actually a signal to simplify. Instead of asking, why isn't this working yet? The better question is, what is unnecessary here? Delay often reveals inefficiencies, overthinking, poor habits, inconsistent execution, misaligned priorities. Those who use delay to subtract instead of abandon come out sharper. Those who quit miss the lesson entirely. The uncomfortable truth is that delay protects you from versions of success you're not ready to manage. It keeps you from becoming visible before you're stable, influential before you're grounded, rewarded before you're disciplined. People who bypass delay often pay later through stress, collapse, or loss of meaning. Delay spreads the cost over time, making growth survivable instead of catastrophic. If you look closely, delay is rarely empty. Something is always forming: judgment, restraint, patience, skill, clarity. The problem is that these are internal assets, and modern culture undervalues what can't be displayed. But internal assets determine how long external ones last. Delay builds what applause can. The real choice during delay is not whether to continue or quit. It's whether to use the time consciously or waste it emotionally. You can complain, compare, and doubt, or you can refine, simplify, and deepen. The outcome will reflect that choice, whether you notice it immediately or not. Delay doesn't punish impatience instantly. It exposes it gradually. And by the time results finally arrive, they mirror exactly how you handled the wait. Most people overestimate how much support they are supposed to receive and underestimate how much solitude is required to build anything meaningful. From an early age, we are conditioned to believe that if we are doing the right thing, others will naturally understand it, encourage it, and stand beside us while we pursue it. That expectation feels reasonable on the surface, but it collapses when tested against real human behavior. People don't resist your growth because they are malicious. They resist it because it disrupts the roles they are used to playing. When your direction changes, the relationship dynamics change, and most people prefer familiarity over potential. The first stage of solitude is emotional confusion. You assume distance means disapproval. You assume silence means you are doing something wrong. But often the opposite is true. Silence appears when your path no longer fits neatly into someone else's expectations. Support tends to exist where predictability exists. When your actions become harder to categorize, people step back not to harm you, but to regain their own sense of balance. This is uncomfortable because humans are social creatures. We are wired to calibrate ourselves through feedback. Solitude removes that mirror. The choice to continue without reinforcement is not heroic, it is practical. Every meaningful pursuit eventually reaches a point where outside validation stops. At that point, you either develop internal standards or you drift. People who cannot tolerate this phase begin adjusting their behavior to regain approval. They soften their ambition, explain themselves excessively, or delay progress to stay relatable. The trade-off is subtle but severe. You exchange long-term alignment for short-term comfort. Over time, that decision erodes respect both from others and from yourself. You can see this pattern clearly in work environments. Someone decides to improve their skills beyond their current role. They study after hours, take on difficult projects, think independently. Initially, there may be encouragement, but as the gap widens, discomfort emerges. Peers feel exposed, routines are questioned, comparison becomes unavoidable. Support turns into distance or mild resistance. At this point, the individual faces a decision: slow down to preserve harmony or continue forward alone. Each option has a cost. Harmony preserves social ease but caps growth. Solitude disrupts comfort but expands capability. Solitude is not the absence of people. It is the absence of agreement. It's being surrounded but not mirrored. This is where many misinterpret what's happening. They think they are being punished when they are actually being filtered. The path narrows not because it's wrong, but because it requires focus that most are unwilling to sustain. When fewer voices echo your direction, you are forced to listen to your own reasoning more carefully. Weak motives collapse under that pressure. Solid ones sharpen. There's also a discipline component to solitude that often goes unnoticed. When no one is watching, encouragement disappears and comparison fades. Your routines become honest. You find out whether you will show up without applause. Many people only perform when observed. Solitude removes performance incentives and leaves only commitment. That is why progress made in isolation tends to be more durable. It is built on habit, not mood. Misplaced focus during this phase can quietly undo everything. Some people respond to solitude by constantly seeking new groups, mentors, or audiences, hoping to replace what was lost. This scattering of attention feels productive, but isn't. Each new social orbit demands explanation, adjustment, and emotional labor. The cost is depth. Instead of building skill, clarity, or momentum, energy gets spent on being understood. Over time, this divided focus slows progress enough to justify self-doubt, creating a cycle that looks like confusion but is really avoidance. There's a financial parallel that makes this easier to understand. Long-term investing requires ignoring daily noise. Prices fluctuate, opinions shift, and narratives change. If you react to every signal, you never benefit from compounding. Solitude functions the same way. It protects you from overreacting to short-term feedback. It limits input so judgment can mature. The trade-off is emotional quiet, which many interpret as loneliness. But quiet is often the environment where clarity grows. Another uncomfortable truth is that some relationships only function when you stay smaller than your potential. Not because others are bad people, but because the relationship was built around a certain balance. When you change, the structure weakens. Solitude is sometimes the byproduct of outgrowing the context, not rejecting it. Holding on to those connections out of guilt delays adaptation. You remain mentally split, one part moving forward, one part preserving the past. That split shows up in inconsistent decisions, diluted effort, and chronic fatigue. People often say they value honesty, but most only tolerate it when it doesn't require change. Solitude emerges when your choices imply a different standard. Your discipline highlights inconsistency. Your focus exposes distraction. This creates tension, and distance becomes the simplest resolution. Interpreting that distance as a signal to stop is a misunderstanding of cause and effect. The distance didn't appear because the path is wrong. It appeared because the path is demanding. There is also a quiet confidence that develops when you stop explaining yourself. Explanation is often a form of seeking permission. When you remove that habit, decisions become cleaner. You act, observe results, adjust. This feedback loop is faster and more accurate than social consensus. Over time, your identity becomes anchored in evidence, not opinion. That internal stability is rare and valuable. The opportunity cost of avoiding solitude is significant. If you structure your life to remain agreeable, you limit the range of actions you're willing to take. You choose predictability over progress. That choice compounds just as powerfully as discipline does, but in the opposite direction. Years later, it shows up as regret disguised as rationalization. People say they were being realistic when they were actually being cautious to the point of stagnation. Solitude, when used correctly, is not isolation. It's selective engagement. You reduce noise to increase signal. You stop asking for consensus and start tracking results. You become less reactive, more deliberate. This doesn't make you superior, it makes you precise. And precision is what long-term outcomes depend on. The most important shift during this phase is accepting that understanding is not a prerequisite for progress. Many people wait to be understood before they move. That waiting costs them years. Progress creates understanding, not the other way around. Once results appear, confusion often turns into admiration. But by then, the work has already been done in quiet, without permission, without reassurance, and without a crowd. Discipline is misunderstood because it doesn't feel spiritual, inspiring, or emotionally rewarding in the moment. People associate belief with emotion, confidence, hope, excitement, certainty. But emotion is unreliable. It fluctuates based on sleep, stress, comparison, and circumstance. If belief were measured by how strongly you feel in a given moment, most people would abandon their values weakly. Discipline exists precisely because emotion cannot be trusted to carry long-term outcomes. At its core, discipline is behavior that does not require agreement from your feelings. It is action taken because you decided once, not because you are motivated today. That distinction matters more than people realize. When you rely on motivation, you are outsourcing your future to a variable you don't control. When you rely on discipline, you reclaim authorship over your direction. The trade-off is obvious but uncomfortable. Discipline feels restrictive in the short term, while motivation feels freeing. The outcome reverses over time. Motivation fades and leaves nothing behind. Discipline compounds and creates options. You can observe this in ordinary life. Someone says they value health, but their behavior is inconsistent. They exercise when inspired, eat well when convenient, rest when exhausted. Nothing stabilizes. Another person follows a simple routine, nothing extreme, nothing dramatic, but they do it regardless of mood. Over months, the second person's results appear almost effortless, while the first feels stuck despite stronger intentions. The difference is not desire, it's behavioral reliability. Discipline exposes the gap between what people say they believe and what they actually prioritize. This is why it feels uncomfortable. It removes the ability to hide behind good intentions. You either show up or you don't. You either protect the habit or you let something else take its place. Over time, your schedule becomes a more accurate statement of your values than your words ever were. Most people overestimate what discipline demands. They imagine intensity, sacrifice, and constant self-denial. In reality, discipline is often boring. It's choosing the same simple action repeatedly. It's avoiding unnecessary decisions. It's setting limits so willpower isn't constantly drained. The discomfort doesn't come from difficulty. It comes from repetition without novelty. Humans crave variation. Discipline asks for consistency. That tension is why so many resist it. There is also a cost to not being disciplined that people rarely calculate. When behavior is inconsistent, energy gets wasted restarting. You spend mental effort recommitting, replanning, remotivating. Progress stalls, not because the goal is unrealistic, but because momentum keeps resetting. Discipline eliminates this friction. Once a behavior is non-negotiable, it stops consuming mental bandwidth. That freed attention can then be applied to improvement instead of maintenance. Consider work performance. A disciplined person doesn't wait to feel ready to begin. They start at the same time each day, regardless of mood. Over time, this builds a reputation for reliability. Opportunities follow reliability, not raw talent. The person who waits for inspiration may occasionally outperform, but they cannot be depended on. Organizations, markets, and systems reward predictability more than brilliance. Discipline creates predictability. Emotionally, discipline can feel isolating. When others are flexible, spontaneous, and reactive, the disciplined person appears rigid. They leave early, say no often, repeat routines. This can create friction in relationships. The trade-off is social ease versus personal alignment. People who avoid discipline to remain agreeable often sacrifice long-term progress for short-term harmony. Years later, they wonder why nothing changed despite good intentions. Discipline also protects you from your future self. Everyone has moments of weakness, distraction, and doubt. Without systems, those moments dictate outcomes. With discipline, they pass without consequence. This is an important distinction. Discipline doesn't eliminate temptation. It reduces its impact. You don't need to win every internal debate if the decision was already made. This is why disciplined people appear calm. They are not constantly renegotiating with themselves. Misplaced focus quietly destroys discipline more than outright laziness. People try to do too much at once. They chase multiple goals, adopt complex routines, overload their schedules. When something breaks, they conclude they lack discipline. In reality, they lack restraint. Discipline thrives under simplicity. Fewer priorities mean fewer excuses. Focus is not about ambition, it's about exclusion. What you leave out matters as much as what you commit to. There's a financial parallel here as well. Long-term wealth is rarely built through dramatic moves. It's built through consistent contributions, controlled spending, and patience. People who chase quick gains often experience volatility that wipes out progress. The disciplined investor accepts slower growth in exchange for stability. Over time, the disciplined approach wins not because it's exciting, but because it survives. Discipline also sharpens judgment. When you consistently act, you generate data. You see what works and what doesn't. You make adjustments based on evidence instead of theory. People who rely on bursts of effort never gather enough information to refine their approach. They remain stuck in trial without learning. Discipline turns experience into insight. There is a subtle identity shift that happens when discipline becomes routine. You stop seeing yourself as someone who is trying and start seeing yourself as someone who does. This reduces internal conflict. You trust yourself more because you've proven reliability through action. That trust is emotionally grounding. It replaces anxiety with quiet confidence. Not because outcomes are guaranteed, but because effort is. The opportunity cost of avoiding discipline is often invisible until much later. Years pass with activity, but little progress. People stay busy, informed, and hopeful, yet stagnant. They confuse motion with direction. Discipline forces alignment between effort and outcome. It removes the illusion of progress and replaces it with measurable change. This honesty can feel harsh, but it is ultimately stabilizing. Discipline is not about denying pleasure or becoming rigid. It's about choosing which pleasures are worth delaying. Immediate comfort competes with long-term leverage. Every disciplined action is a vote for a future version of yourself that has more options, not fewer. The sacrifice is real, but so is the return. What makes discipline the truest proof of belief is that it operates without witnesses. Anyone can claim faith in an idea when conditions are favorable. Discipline shows belief when conditions are neutral or unfavorable. It shows belief when nothing happens immediately. It shows belief when quitting would be easier and socially acceptable. That consistency is not loud. It doesn't announce itself. But over time, it reshapes circumstances in ways emotion never could. When discipline becomes your default, life becomes less chaotic. Not because challenges disappear, but because your response stabilizes. You stop overreacting to setbacks and underreacting to opportunities. You stay centered. That steadiness is rare, and it is built quietly. One repeated decision at a time. Loss is often mislabeled as failure because people judge outcomes by what disappears instead of what becomes possible afterward. When something ends, especially a relationship, role, or identity, it feels like regression. Emotionally, loss registers as rejection or punishment. Rationally, it is more often a correction. It removes a structure that no longer supports the direction you are moving toward. The discomfort comes not from the loss itself, but from the attachment to what that structure represented. Most attachments are formed during earlier versions of ourselves. They are aligned with who we were, not who we are becoming. As priorities shift, the fit weakens. What once felt supportive begins to feel restrictive. The mind notices first, then the behavior changes, and finally the relationship strains. This sequence is predictable. When people ignore the early signals, loss arrives abruptly. It feels sudden, but it was prepared for quietly over time. People tend to romanticize loyalty without considering alignment. Loyalty without evaluation becomes inertia. You stay not because it makes sense, but because leaving feels disloyal or uncomfortable. The trade-off is rarely stated clearly. You exchange growth for familiarity. Over time, this choice accumulates tension. Energy that could be directed toward building something new is spent maintaining what already exists. The cost is subtle but significant. You can observe this in everyday routines. Someone continues in a role they've outgrown because it provides stability. The work no longer challenges them, but it is predictable. At first, this feels reasonable. Months pass. Engagement drops. Creativity fades. Irritation rises. The role hasn't changed, but the person has. Eventually, performance suffers or dissatisfaction becomes unavoidable. The eventual exit feels like failure, but it was actually the final step in a long process of misalignment. Loss often clarifies priorities that were previously blurred. When something is present, it consumes attention. When it's gone, that attention is released. The immediate instinct is to fill the space. This is a mistake. Space is not a problem to solve. It's an opportunity to observe. What remains when something leaves is often more revealing than what was there. Patterns emerge, desires surface. You see what you were tolerating instead of choosing. There is an emotional honesty required to accept that some losses are necessary. People prefer to believe that with enough effort, everything can be preserved. This belief leads to overextension. You try to be everything to everyone. You compromise boundaries. You delay decisions. Eventually, the system breaks under its own weight. Loss arrives anyway, but with more damage. Accepting loss earlier reduces collateral cost. Relationships are the clearest example. When values diverge, maintaining connection requires increasing effort. Conversations become careful. Decisions require negotiation. You start editing yourself. This is a signal. Alignment doesn't require constant explanation. When you ignore this, you pay with mental energy. Focus fragments. You think about what to say, what to hide, how to avoid conflict. That cognitive load reduces effectiveness elsewhere. Work suffers. Health suffers. Momentum slows. Misplaced focus during periods of loss often leads people to seek replacement instead of reflection. They rush into new commitments to avoid discomfort. This creates cycles of repeated misalignment. Without understanding why the loss occurred, the pattern repeats. Different context, same outcome. Reflection is not passive, it's diagnostic. It helps identify which trade-offs you accepted unconsciously and which ones you're no longer willing to make. Loss also tests identity. When something external disappears, you are forced to confront what remains. This can feel destabilizing. People often cling to old attachments because they anchor self-image. Letting go requires redefining who you are without that reference point. This process is uncomfortable but necessary. Identity based on outdated roles limits future decisions. Identity grounded in principles adapts. There is a practical advantage to loss that rarely gets acknowledged. It simplifies decision-making. Fewer commitments mean clearer priorities. When your energy is no longer split, execution improves. This is not theoretical. You can measure it in attention span, follow-through, and emotional availability. Focus improves when you remove obligations that no longer align. The trade-off is temporary discomfort for long-term clarity. Financial decisions illustrate this well. Investors who refuse to let go of underperforming assets often justify it with emotional reasoning. They remember why they bought it. They hope it will recover. Meanwhile, capital remains tied up, unable to move toward better opportunities. Letting go feels like admitting failure. In reality, it's reallocating resources. The same logic applies to time and relationships. Holding on to what no longer performs has an opportunity cost. Loss also builds discernment. After experiencing misalignment, you become more selective. You ask better questions. You pay attention to early signs instead of ignoring them. This is not cynicism, it's learning. People who avoid loss at all costs avoid learning at the same time. They repeat patterns because nothing interrupts them. Loss interrupts. That interruption, while painful, carries information. There is a tendency to frame necessary loss as something that could have been avoided if you were better, more patient, or more understanding. This framing keeps people stuck in self-blame. It assumes that compatibility is a moral issue rather than a structural one. Two things can be good and still not fit. Recognizing this reduces resentment. It allows you to separate self-worth from outcome. Sacrifice is often misunderstood as giving up something valuable. In reality, sacrifice is choosing which value to protect. When you let go of what no longer aligns, you are protecting focus, energy, and future capacity. That choice feels like loss in the short term, but it functions as investment. You free resources to be deployed more effectively elsewhere. The quiet truth is that many losses you mourn are actually endings you postponed. They didn't arrive suddenly. They arrived when continuation became unsustainable. Seeing them clearly doesn't remove the pain, but it does remove confusion. Pain with clarity is manageable. Pain with confusion lingers. When loss is reframed as information rather than punishment, it becomes usable. You stop asking why it happened and start asking what it revealed. That shift changes behavior. You make cleaner decisions. You invest with intention. You protect alignment. Over time, this leads to fewer dramatic losses and more deliberate transitions. Loss, when integrated properly, refines your sense of direction. It doesn't make you harder. It makes you more precise. You learn what you're willing to give energy to and what you're not. You become less reactive and more deliberate. This is not emotional numbness. It is emotional maturity built through experience, not avoidance. Humility is often confused with low confidence or self-suppression, but in practice it is neither. It is accurate self-assessment. It is knowing what you know, knowing what you don't, and acting accordingly without the need to broadcast either. When people rush to prove themselves, it is usually not because they are capable, but because they are unsure. The urge to be seen, acknowledged, or validated often precedes mastery, not the other way around. Long-term outcomes favor those who allow ability to mature before visibility demands it. Most people underestimate how distracting recognition can be. Early praise feels energizing, but it subtly shifts focus from process to perception. Instead of asking, what improves this, the question becomes, how is this being received? That change in orientation alters decision-making. Choices start serving image instead of function. Over time, performance plateaus because learning slows. The trade-off is clear but rarely examined. Immediate recognition in exchange for reduced depth. You can see this dynamic in everyday work. Someone receives attention for a partial success. Meetings increase. Opinions are requested. Expectations rise faster than skill. Time once spent refining work is now spent maintaining status. Errors appear, not because the person lacks potential, but because growth was interrupted. Humility would have delayed exposure until capability matched demand. The absence of humility accelerates pressure before structure exists to handle it. Humility also protects focus. When you accept that you are still learning, you remain open to feedback. You listen instead of defending. You observe instead of reacting. This openness is not weakness, it is efficiency. Defensive behavior consumes energy without improving outcomes. Humble behavior channels energy into adjustment. Over long periods, small adjustments compound into large advantages. There is an emotional cost to humility that discourages people from practicing it. Being overlooked feels unfair. Watching others receive recognition while you work quietly can trigger comparison and doubt. This is where long-term thinking becomes essential. Recognition is not evenly distributed in the short term, but capability is. When capability accumulates without attention, it creates leverage. When attention accumulates without capability, it creates fragility. Misplaced focus during this phase often takes the form of performance signaling. People begin optimizing for appearance rather than substance. They talk more than they test. They announce plans instead of executing them. This behavior creates the illusion of progress while slowing real development. The opportunity cost is severe. Time spent curating perception is time not spent building competence. Humility simplifies decision-making by narrowing the objective. The goal is no longer to impress. It is to improve. This clarity reduces noise. You choose tasks based on learning value rather than visibility. You accept unglamorous work because it strengthens foundations. Over time, this creates a skill set that is deep rather than wide, durable rather than flashy. There is a financial parallel here. Investors who chase attention often overpay. They buy what is popular, not what is sound. Humble investing avoids crowded trades and focuses on fundamentals. The reward is slower validation but stronger returns. The same logic applies to personal development. Avoiding the spotlight allows fundamentals to mature without distortion. Humility also influences how you respond to setbacks. When ego is involved, mistakes feel threatening. You defend, rationalize, or deflect. Learning slows because admitting error feels costly. With humility, mistakes are data. You adjust without drama. This creates resilience. Over time, humble individuals recover faster and adapt more effectively than those who protect image at all costs. There is a social dimension to humility that is often misunderstood. Quiet competence earns trust differently than loud confidence. People may not notice immediately, but they rely on it when stakes rise. In high-pressure situations, consistency matters more than charisma. Those who invested in mastery instead of attention become anchors. Their influence grows not through assertion, but through reliability. Short-term humility also guards against premature certainty. Many people lock into rigid beliefs too early because changing their mind publicly feels embarrassing. Humility allows beliefs to evolve. You can update without losing identity because your identity isn't built on being right. This flexibility is essential in complex environments where information changes and assumptions fail. The sacrifice humility demands is patience. You must tolerate being underestimated. You must accept that progress will be quiet and that others may misunderstand your pace. This is difficult in a culture that rewards speed and visibility, but the trade-off favors those who can endure it. When results finally surface, they carry weight because they are backed by substance. Divided priorities often emerge when humility is absent. You try to grow and perform at the same time. You split attention between learning and impressing. Neither receives full energy. Growth slows and performance feels stressful. Choosing humility resolves this conflict. You delay performance